I still remember the exact moment I realized I'd been erased from my own grandson's life. Funny how after 7 decades of putting family first, it was something so seemingly simple that shattered everything. A child's innocent question that revealed just how completely I'd been replaced. But that's how betrayal works, isn't it? Years of small cuts, tiny dismissals, little moments where you're pushed aside for someone better, and then one day, one moment, one sentence from a 4-year-old's mouth, and your entire world crumbles. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Grace Sullivan, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 5 years, I've been living what I thought was a blessing, sharing my home with my son Oliver and his wife Ginger, helping to raise my precious grandson Timothy. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't sharing my home at all. I was slowly being evicted from it, one kitchen cabinet at a time, one bedtime story at a time, one family tradition at a time. The moment everything changed happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my kitchen. Well, what used to be my kitchen, making Timothy's favorite chocolate chip pancakes. It was our special tradition, something we'd done every Tuesday morning since he could sit in a high chair. I'd taught him how to crack eggs without getting shells in the batter, how to flip pancakes so they landed perfectly in the pan, how to arrange them on the plate in a smiley face. These weren't just pancakes. They were our memories, our bond, our sacred time together. Timothy came bouncing into the kitchen in his dinosaur pajamas, his dark hair still messy from sleep, carrying his favorite stuffed dragon. At 4 years old, he was at that magical age where everything was wonder and possibility. He climbed onto his special stool, the one I'd painted red just for him, and watched me pour the batter into the pan. "Grandma Grace," he said in that sweet, sleepy voice that always melted my heart. "Why are you making pancakes?" I looked at him, confused. "It's Tuesday, sweetheart. Tuesday is our pancake day, remember?" He tilted his head, those big brown eyes, so much like Oliver's when he was little, filled with genuine confusion. "But Mama Ginger said she makes the best pancakes. She said her pancakes are better than yours, and that I should ask her to make them from now on." The spatula in my hand froze halfway to the pan. "Did she now?" "Uh-huh. She said grandmas are for visiting, not for cooking." "Mamas do the cooking." He swung his little legs back and forth, completely unaware that he'd just driven a knife straight through my chest. "Mama Ginger said when I'm hungry, I should come find her, not you. She said that's what real mamas do." There it was. The moment. After 5 years of watching Ginger slowly but systematically replace me in every aspect of Timothy's life, she'd finally succeeded in rewriting his understanding of who I was supposed to be. Not his beloved Grandma Grace who had been there for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every milestone. Just someone who was for visiting. I managed to finish making the pancakes, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind reeled. I arranged them in Timothy's favorite smiley face, added the whipped cream nose and chocolate chip eyes just like always, but when I set the plate in front of him, he looked uncomfortable. "I think I should go ask Mama Ginger if it's okay to eat these," he said quietly. "She said I need to check with her about food now." That's when I knew. This wasn't about pancakes. This wasn't about a daughter-in-law finding her place in the family. This was about complete replacement. Ginger hadn't just moved into my kitchen. She'd moved into my role, my relationship with my grandson, my very identity within my own family. I watched my 4-year-old grandson, the child I'd helped raise from birth, the little boy who used to run to me when he was hurt, who called me his best cooking partner, ask permission to eat the pancakes I'd made him every Tuesday for 3 years. I watched him hesitate, confused by the conflicting messages he'd been given about who was supposed to care for him. "Of course you can eat them, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Grandma Grace will always." make pancakes for you." But even as I said it, I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Ginger had done her work well. She'd planted seeds of doubt, created confusion about my place in his life, made him question whether loving me was somehow wrong or disloyal to her. As Timothy ate his pancakes, quickly, nervously, as if he were doing something forbidden, I stood at my kitchen counter and felt something I'd never experienced before. Not anger, not hurt, but a cold, crystalline clarity. I'd been fighting the wrong battle. For 5 years, I'd been trying to coexist, to share space, to be accommodating and understanding. I'd made excuses for Ginger's behavior, told myself she was just finding her way as a new mother, convinced myself that love multiplies rather than divides. But standing there, watching my grandson eat my pancakes while glancing nervously toward the door in case his real mama caught him, I finally understood the truth. This wasn't about sharing or blending families. This was about conquest. Ginger hadn't moved into my home to become part of our family. She'd moved in to replace me entirely. The old Grace would have swallowed this pain, made excuses, tried harder to accommodate everyone's needs but her own. The old Grace would have convinced herself that keeping the peace was more important than standing up for herself. The old Grace would have accepted being demoted to grandma for visiting in her own home. But something had shifted in that moment. Something fundamental and irreversible. As I watched Timothy finish his pancakes and run off to find Ginger, because that's what he'd been trained to do, I made a decision that would change everything. If Ginger wanted to play the role of the only mother that mattered in this house, I was going to show her exactly what happened when you tried to erase Grace Sullivan from her own family. She'd moved into my kitchen thinking she could take over my life. Soon, she'd be moving out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the harsh lesson that some women don't go quietly into the background, no matter how hard you try to push them there. The war for my family was about to begin, and Ginger had no idea what she'd just awakened. To understand how completely Ginger managed to turn my world upside down, you need to know what my life looked like before she arrived. I wasn't some helpless old woman sitting in a rocking chair, waiting for visitors. I was Grace Sullivan, and at 68 I was still very much the matriarch of my family. I lived in a sprawling Victorian house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the same house where I'd raised Oliver and his sister Georgia. My late husband Arthur and I had bought it 45 years ago when it was practically falling down, and we'd spent decades turning it into something magnificent. 3 stories, wraparound porch, a kitchen that was the heart of everything, and enough bedrooms to house visiting family comfortably. Arthur used to joke that I ran it like a benevolent dictatorship, and he wasn't wrong. Everything had its place. Everyone had their role, and love was measured in home-cooked meals and midnight conversations around my kitchen table. When Arthur passed 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, I thought my world was ending. We'd been married for 42 years, and I genuinely didn't know how to exist without him. The house felt enormous and empty, echoing with memories but devoid of the warmth that comes from shared daily life. I'd lie awake at night in our bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should sell the house and move into one of those senior communities where you play bingo and complain about your medications. That's when Oliver made what seemed like a perfect suggestion. He and Ginger had been married for 2 years, and they were expecting their first child. They were living in a cramped apartment in Chicago, both working demanding jobs. Oliver as an accountant at a large firm, Ginger as a marketing coordinator. For some tech company, the baby was due in November, and they were stressed about childcare, finances, and space. "Mom," Oliver said during one of our weekly phone calls, "what would you think about us moving in with you for a while, just until we get on our feet financially and figure out this whole parenting thing? The house is so big, and we could help you maintain it. Plus, Timothy would grow up knowing his grandmother." It seemed like an answer to everyone's prayers. I'd have family in the house again, purpose in helping raise my grandchild, and Oliver would have the support he needed during this crucial time. Ginger seemed enthusiastic about the idea when we discussed it, talking about how wonderful it would be for Timothy to have such a strong grandmother figure in his life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I never really had that, she told me over dinner at my kitchen table, her hand resting on her growing belly. My grandmother died when I was little, and my mom's mother was difficult. I want Timothy to have better than that. I want him to know what it feels like to be unconditionally loved by multiple generations. I was charmed by her sincerity, touched by her vulnerability. Here was a young woman who understood the value of family, who wanted to give her child the gift of extended love and support. I immediately began preparing the house, turning Arthur's old study into a nursery, making sure the master guest suite was perfect for the new family of 3. When they moved in just before Timothy was born, everything felt right. Oliver seemed relieved to be home, constantly commenting on how good it was to smell my cooking again, to sit on the porch in the evenings like we used to when he was young. Ginger appeared grateful and deferential, often asking for my advice about everything from nursery decorating to prenatal vitamins. Those first few months after Timothy's birth were magical. I'd wake up to the sound of a baby crying and feel my heart swell with purpose again. I'd find Ginger in the middle of the night, exhausted and overwhelmed, and I'd gently take Timothy from her arms. "Go get some sleep, sweetheart," I'd whisper. "Grandma Grace has this." I became Timothy's night shift caregiver, his afternoon entertainment when Ginger needed to nap, his constant companion during those early months when babies need so much attention. I'd rock him for hours, sing him the same lullabies I'd sung to Oliver and Georgia, tell him stories about his daddy when he was little. Those moments felt like pure gold. This tiny person who depended on me, loved me unconditionally, and filled the empty spaces in my heart that Arthur's death had created. Oliver would come home from work to find me and Timothy in the kitchen, me cooking dinner while he sat in his bouncy seat, fascinated by the sounds and smells around him. "Mom, you're a lifesaver," Oliver would say, kissing my cheek. "I don't know how we'd manage without you." Even Ginger seemed appreciative in those early days. She'd return from errands to find Timothy fed, bathed, and content, and she'd thank me profusely. "Grace, you're amazing," she'd say. "I'm so lucky to have you." I felt useful again, needed again, important again. The house was alive with purpose. Baby bottles in the kitchen, toys scattered in the living room, the sound of family life filling every corner. I'd transformed from a grieving widow rattling around in an empty house to a vital part of a young family's life. Timothy and I developed our special routines early on. Morning pancakes on Tuesdays became our tradition when he graduated to solid foods. I'd read him stories before his afternoon nap, always from the same rocking chair where I'd read to Oliver decades earlier. Bath time was our silly time, filled with rubber ducky voices and lots of splashing. I taught him to identify birds at the kitchen window feeder, to help me water the plants on the sun porch, to help me cook by stirring ingredients in his own little bowl. "Gamma gay," he'd squeal when he saw me coming, his face lighting up with pure joy. Those first attempts at saying Grandma Grace were music to my ears, proof that I was central to his world, essential to his happiness. This was my life before everything changed. This was when I thought we were building something beautiful together. 3 generations under one roof, sharing responsibilities and love, creating memories that would last a lifetime. I thought Ginger appreciated having help. I thought Oliver was grateful for my support. I thought Timothy would grow up feeling doubly blessed by having such an involved grandmother. I had no idea that what I saw as shared family life, Ginger saw as competition. What I interpreted as gratitude was actually resentment building like pressure in a steam kettle. What I believed was a harmonious blending of generations was actually the setup for a careful, calculated campaign to eliminate me from my own family. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you how Ginger went from grateful daughter-in-law to the woman who tried to steal my grandson's heart. The changes started so subtly that I almost missed them entirely. Looking back now, I can see that Ginger was far more strategic than I ever gave her credit for. She didn't launch an all-out assault on my place in the family. Instead, she waged a careful campaign of small adjustments, tiny suggestions, and gradual boundary shifts that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively began to reshape the entire dynamic of our household. It began when Timothy was about 18 months old, just starting to walk and talk in earnest. Ginger had taken a part-time work-from-home position, which meant she was around the house more during the day. At first, I welcomed this development. I thought it would be wonderful for Timothy to have more time with his mother, and I looked forward to sharing parenting duties more equally. The first change was so minor I barely registered it. I'd been Timothy's primary caregiver during his afternoon naps, the one who read him stories and rocked him to sleep in the nursery's glider chair, the same chair where I'd rocked Oliver, 30 years earlier. One Tuesday, as I was heading upstairs with Timothy for his usual nap-time routine, Ginger intercepted us in the hallway. "Oh, Grace, would you mind if I took over nap time today?" she asked with a bright smile. "I've been feeling like I haven't had enough one-on-one time with him lately, and I thought this might be a nice opportunity for some mommy-son bonding." Of course, I agreed immediately. What grandmother wouldn't want her daughter-in-law to have? Special time with her child? I handed Timothy over, telling myself this was a good thing, a sign that Ginger was becoming more confident and involved as a mother. But when I offered to resume nap-time duties the next day, Ginger had another request. "Actually, Grace, would it be okay if I kept handling nap time?" Timothy seemed to respond so well to my routine yesterday, and I'd hate to confuse him by switching back and forth. Again, it seemed reasonable. Consistency was important for toddlers, and if Ginger had found a routine that worked, why disrupt it? I agreed, though I felt a small pang of loss at giving up those peaceful moments in the rocking chair. The kitchen changes came next, and these were even more insidious because they were framed as helpfulness and organization. Ginger began staying, up later than Oliver and me, using the quiet evening hours to tidy up the kitchen. I'd come down in the morning to find my spice rack completely reorganized, arranged alphabetically instead of by frequency of use as I'd had it for decades. "I hope you don't mind," she said when I mentioned it. "I was looking for paprika last night and couldn't find it, so I thought it might be easier if everything was in alphabetical order. It's more logical, don't you think?" She'd moved my coffee maker to a different counter, explaining that the new position created better workflow in the kitchen. She'd rearranged my utensil drawers for efficiency, relocated my mixing bowls to a higher cabinet to free up prime real estate for everyday items, and even switched out my kitchen towels for new ones that coordinate better with the color scheme. Each change, taken individually, seemed like such a small thing to object to. How petty would I sound complaining that my daughter-in-law had alphabetized my spices or moved my coffee maker 3 feet to the left? But collectively, these modifications meant that I could no longer operate efficiently in my own kitchen. I'd reach for the cinnamon where it had always been, only to remember it was now with the C's instead of next to the sugar. I'd fumble for my favorite wooden spoon in what had been its drawer for 20 years, only to find it had been relocated to make more sense. The grocery shopping transition was perhaps the most clever. Ginger began asking if she could help with the weekly shopping, suggesting we make lists together to avoid duplication and waste. This seemed wonderfully collaborative at first. We'd sit at the kitchen table every Sunday evening, planning meals for the week and creating a comprehensive shopping list. But gradually, Ginger began taking over more of the actual shopping trips. "I need to run to the pharmacy anyway," she'd say, "so why don't I just pick up the groceries too?" No need for you to make an extra trip. Or, I'm meeting my friend Harriet for lunch near the grocery store, so I might as well take care of the shopping while I'm out. Soon, she was doing all the grocery shopping, and with it came control over meal planning. She'd returned from shopping, trips with ingredients for recipes I'd never heard of, explaining that she'd seen something interesting and wanted to try it. My recipe file, filled with family favorites accumulated over decades, began collecting dust as Ginger introduced new meals that Timothy loved, but that bore no resemblance to the comfort foods he'd grown up eating. The most painful erosion was in my special traditions with Timothy. Our Tuesday morning pancake ritual lasted longer than most, probably because it was so established by the time Ginger began her campaign. But even that began to shift in subtle ways. Ginger started joining us for pancake mornings, which at first seemed lovely. "This is so nice," she'd say, sipping coffee while Timothy and I cooked together. "Such a sweet tradition." But her presence changed the dynamic. Timothy, naturally, began looking to her for approval and guidance, asking, "Mama, can I crack the egg now?" instead of just diving in with his usual enthusiasm. Then Ginger began making suggestions for improvements to our routine. "You know, Grace, I read that blueberries are much more nutritious than chocolate chips. Maybe we could try those instead." Or, "Timothy's pediatrician mentioned that whole wheat flour is better for growing children. We should probably switch to that." Each suggestion came wrapped in concern for Timothy's health and development, making me seem unreasonable if I objected. How could I argue against better nutrition? For my grandson? How could I insist on keeping traditions that might not be optimal for his well-being? The reading time erosion was equally gradual. I'd been Timothy's primary storyteller since birth, the one who introduced him to classic children's books and made up elaborate tales about the adventures of his stuffed animals. But Ginger began appearing at bedtime, suggesting that maybe tonight Mama should read the story, or bringing new books that became Timothy's favorites, eclipsing the well-worn volumes we'd shared. By Timothy's second birthday, I realized with growing unease that my role in his daily life had shrunk considerably. I was no longer the one who put him down for naps, planned his meals, chose his books, or even, increasingly, received his first hugs when he woke up in the morning. I'd become more of an assistant in his care rather than a primary caregiver, helpful when needed but no longer essential to his routines. When I tried to discuss this with Oliver, he seemed genuinely confused by my concerns. "Mom, isn't this what we wanted? Ginger's really stepped up as a mother. She's more confident, more involved. I thought you'd be happy that she's taking such good care of Timothy." And he was right in a way. This was what we'd wanted. Ginger to become a confident, engaged mother. I just hadn't realized that her confidence would come at the expense of my connection with my grandson, or that her engagement would require my gradual displacement from the very relationships that had given my life meaning and purpose. But I was still making excuses, still telling myself that this was normal family evolution, still believing that love expands rather than contracts. I had no idea that these small erosions were just the preparation phase for something much more devastating to come. The moment that shattered my world completely came during Timothy's 4th birthday party. I should have seen it coming, but I was still operating under the delusion that despite all the small erosions, I remained an important figure in my grandson's life. I still believed that blood meant something, that the years I'd spent caring for him counted for something, that love was stronger than manipulation. I'd been planning Timothy's birthday party for months. It was going to be dinosaur-themed, his absolute obsession at the time. I'd researched decorations, planned games, designed an elaborate dinosaur cake that I intended to bake myself. This wasn't just any birthday party. It was Timothy's first big kid party with friends from his preschool, and I wanted it to be magical. 3 weeks before the party, I was in my kitchen, still thinking of it as my kitchen despite everything, sketching. out cake designs and making lists of party supplies when Ginger walked in with her laptop and a bright, energetic smile that immediately put me on edge. "Grace, we need to talk about Timothy's party," she said, settling into the chair across from me at my own kitchen table. "I've been doing some research and I think we need to make some changes to ensure everything goes perfectly." She opened her laptop and turned it toward me, revealing a Pinterest board titled Timothy's Perfect Fourth Birthday. Every image was carefully curated, professional-looking dinosaur decorations, an elaborate multi-tiered cake from an expensive bakery, and a detailed timeline that accounted for every minute of the 3-hour event. "I know you've been working on plans," Ginger continued, her tone carefully considerate. "But I realize that this party is really important for Timothy's social development. The other parents will be there, and I want to make sure we make a good impression. You understand." I stared at the screen, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting, Ginger?" "Well, for starters, I think we should order the cake from Sweet Dreams Bakery. They do these incredible fondant sculptures that look exactly like real dinosaurs. I know you were planning to bake something, but honestly, Grace, your baking is more home style. This needs to look professional." The dismissal of my baking, something I'd been praised for my entire adult life, something that had brought joy to countless family celebrations, hit me like a physical blow. But I managed to keep my voice steady. "I see. And what about the decorations I ordered?" Ginger's smile became slightly strained. "About that, I actually went ahead and ordered a complete party package from Events by Emma. They're a professional party planning service, and they'll handle everything: decorations, activities, even entertainment. There's going to be a person in a dinosaur costume who does educational presentations." "You canceled my decorations?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't cancel them exactly," she said quickly. "I just thought we could return them and put that money towards something more elevated. Timothy's friends come from professional families, Grace. Their parties are quite sophisticated. I don't want Timothy to feel embarrassed." The implication was clear. My homemade decorations, my planned activities, my dinosaur cake would embarrass my grandson. Everything I'd lovingly prepared was being replaced by hired professionals because I wasn't good enough. But the real devastating blow came with her next announcement. "Also, I've decided that I should be the one to give the welcome speech to the parents and kids," Ginger said, scrolling through her laptop. "I've written something really nice about how grateful we are that everyone could come celebrate our son. I think it's important that it comes from Timothy's mother, don't you? Our son. Not my grandson, or even Timothy. Our son. As if I had no relationship to him at all." The day of the party, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Professional decorators had transformed my backyard into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of any personal touch. The cake was indeed spectacular, a 3-foot-tall T-Rex that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I'd dressed carefully for the occasion, wearing my best blue dress and the pearl necklace Arthur had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like the dignified grandmother I was, someone worthy of being included in this celebration. But as the guests arrived, 15 preschoolers and their parents, I quickly realized that I'd been relegated to the role of elderly relative rather than party host. Ginger greeted everyone at the front door, introducing herself as Timothy's mom and graciously accepting compliments on the beautiful party setup. When parents asked about logistics or activities, they naturally turned to her for answers. Found myself standing awkwardly on my own porch, smiling politely as people I'd never met complimented Ginger on her amazing party planning skills and her gorgeous home. When I tried to introduce myself as Timothy's grandmother, I was met with polite but brief acknowledgments before conversations turned back to Ginger. The moment that broke me came when it was time to sing Happy Birthday. Timothy was seated at the head of the beautifully decorated table, grinning widely as everyone gathered around. Ginger positioned herself directly behind his chair, her hands on his shoulders, beaming with maternal pride. "Before we sing," Ginger announced to the crowd, "I just want to say how blessed we are to have such wonderful friends here to celebrate our Timothy. This little boy is the light of my life, and watching him grow into such a smart, kind, loving child has been the greatest joy I've ever experienced." The parents murmured appreciative agreement, smiling at this picture of devoted motherhood. Ginger continued, her voice growing more emotional. "I especially want to thank my husband Oliver for being such an amazing father, and my mother-in-law Grace for letting us use her beautiful home for this special day. Letting us use her home, as if I were doing them a favor by allowing them to throw a party in the house where I'd lived for 45 years, where I'd raised Oliver, where I'd cared for Timothy since birth." But the final crushing blow came when she added, "Timothy is so lucky to have such a loving family. His daddy worked so hard to provide for us, and his mama, that's me." She laughed, squeezing Timothy's shoulders as the crowd chuckled indulgently. "His mama tries every day to give him the very best of everything. She'd erased me completely." In front of 15 families, at a party in my own backyard, celebrating my own grandson, I'd been reduced to a landlady who'd graciously allowed the real family to use her space. As everyone sang, "Happy Birthday," and Timothy blew out the candles on the professional cake I hadn't made, I stood at the edge of my own porch and felt something die inside me. Not anger, that would come later. What I felt was a cold, clear understanding of exactly where I stood. In this family hierarchy, nowhere. I stood nowhere at all. Timothy didn't look for me when he made his wish. He didn't save me a piece of cake. When people asked him about his favorite gifts, he didn't mention the wooden toy chest I'd spent weeks crafting in my garage. When it came time for group photos, I wasn't invited into the family shots. I was a guest at my own grandson's birthday party, in my own home, watching my own family celebrate without me. That night, after the professional cleaners had cleared away every trace of the celebration, I sat alone in my kitchen and finally admitted the truth I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Ginger hadn't just moved into my home. She'd systematically erased me from my own life, and I'd let her do it with barely a whisper of protest. That night, after the last guest had left, and the professional cleaners had erased every trace of Timothy's birthday celebration, I found myself alone in my kitchen at 2 a.m., unable to sleep. The house was finally quiet, Oliver snoring peacefully upstairs, Timothy exhausted from his big day, and Ginger probably dreaming about her successful party hosting debut. But I couldn't stop replaying the events of the day, couldn't shake the image of myself standing on the periphery of my own grandson's birthday party like some elderly neighbor who'd been invited out of politeness. The more I thought about it, the more clearly I could see the careful architecture of my own erasure. I walked through my house in the darkness, really seeing it for the first time in months. When had Ginger's throw pillows replaced mine on the living room sofa? When had her scented candles taken over the mantelpiece where my family photos used to sit? When had her magazines started appearing on my coffee table, her preferred brand of coffee in my pantry, her choice of hand soap in my guest bathroom? I stopped in front of the refrigerator where our family photos were displayed with magnets. There was Timothy's first day of preschool, a picture Ginger had taken and printed. Timothy at the zoo, another Ginger photo. Timothy's soccer registration day, Ginger again. I searched for photos that I had taken, moments I had captured, and found exactly 3 among the dozens displayed. 3. It was as if I'd become a ghost in my own life, present but not really there, visible but not important enough to document. Opened the refrigerator and found it stocked entirely with foods I hadn't chosen. Organic milk instead of the regular brand I'd bought for decades, expensive yogurt in flavors I didn't recognize, vegetables I'd never learned to prepare. Even my refrigerator had been colonized. Standing there in my nightgown at 2 a.m., staring into a refrigerator that had become foreign to me, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not the hot rush of anger, but something colder and more dangerous. Absolute clarity about what had been happening to me. For 2 years, I'd been making excuses. Ginger's just finding her confidence as a mother. She's trying to help by organizing things. This is normal adjustment when 3 generations live together. I should be grateful she's so involved with Timothy. But standing in my kitchen, that night, I finally saw the truth with perfect, undeniable clarity. This wasn't about Ginger finding her place in our family. This was about her systematically removing me from mine. Every helpful reorganization of my kitchen had been designed to make me feel displaced in my own space. Every gradual takeover of my routines with Timothy had been calculated to sever our bond. Every suggestion for improvement had been aimed at making my contributions seem inadequate, outdated, embarrassing. And the birthday party, that had been the final masterpiece. In front of 15 families, Ginger had publicly established herself as Timothy's only parent who mattered, reducing me to the role of generous landlady who'd allowed the real family to use her space. I thought about Timothy's confusion that morning when I'd made pancakes, his nervous glance toward the door to see if Mama Ginger would catch him eating my food. A 4-year-old child had been trained to feel guilty about accepting love and care from his own grandmother. That level of manipulation didn't happen overnight or by accident. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Arthur and I had shared morning coffee for 42 years, where I'd helped Oliver with homework, where I'd fed Timothy countless meals, and felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. I'd been fighting the wrong battle. For 2 years, I'd been trying to coexist, to compromise, to find ways for everyone to be happy. I'd been operating under the assumption that this was a misunderstanding that could be resolved with patience and communication. I'd been treating this like a family problem when it was actually something much more strategic and deliberate. Ginger hadn't moved into my home to become part of our family. She'd moved in to replace me entirely, and she'd been remarkably successful. But here's what Ginger didn't understand about Grace Sullivan. I hadn't survived 73 years, 42 years of marriage, and 5 years of widowhood by being a pushover. I'd raised 2 children largely on my own while Arthur worked long hours. I'd managed household finances, navigated family crises, and maintained this house and family through decades of challenges. I was not some sweet, confused old lady who could be gently nudged aside to make room for a younger woman's ambitions. I was a woman who'd built a life, created a home, and earned my place in this family through decades of love, sacrifice, and devotion. If Ginger wanted to play games of replacement and erasure, I was about to show her how those games worked when someone played back with the experience and determination that comes from 7 decades of life. I went upstairs to my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser, pulling out a leather-bound address book that I hadn't used in years. Some battles require allies, and I was about to call in reinforcements that Ginger never knew existed. The old Grace would have swallowed this humiliation, made more excuses, tried harder to accommodate everyone's needs but her own. The old Grace would have convinced herself that keeping the peace was more important than maintaining her dignity. But as I sat there planning my next moves, I realized something liberating. The old Grace was gone. She'd died somewhere between the birthday party speech and this moment of midnight clarity. What remained was a woman who understood exactly what she was dealing with and exactly what needed to be done about it. The war for my family was about to begin, and Ginger had severely underestimated her opponent. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes only after you've stopped lying to yourself. While Oliver left for work and Ginger took Timothy to his swimming lesson, I began what would become the most important research project of my life. I started in my own filing cabinet, pulling out documents I hadn't looked at in years. The original agreement when Oliver and Ginger moved in had been informal, a family arrangement based on trust and mutual benefit. But I had documentation of everything. Utility bills showing the dramatic increase in costs since they'd arrived, grocery receipts that demonstrated I'd been feeding 3 additional people for nearly 5 years, medical insurance statements where I'd added them as dependents. More importantly, I had the deed to my house, the will Arthur and I had created together, and the bank statements showing that every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every major repair had been paid from my accounts. This house wasn't some shared family property. It was mine, completely and legally mine. But financial documentation was only the beginning. If I was going to reclaim my place in this family, I needed to understand exactly how Ginger had managed to manipulate the situation so effectively. So I did something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to the small details of daily life with the analytical eye of someone gathering evidence. I noticed that Ginger had slowly but systematically replaced every personal item in the common areas of my house. The family photos on the mantelpiece were now exclusively pictures she'd taken. The books on the living room shelves were titles she'd chosen. Even the kitchen magnets had been swapped out for ones that reflected her aesthetic preferences. More disturbing was how she'd begun controlling the flow of information within our household. When Oliver called during the day to check in, Ginger always answered the phone. When neighbors stopped by, she greeted them at the door. When mail arrived for me, she'd helpfully sort through it first. I realized I'd been gradually isolated from the outside world without even noticing it happening. I called my daughter Georgia in Portland, something I hadn't done in months. The conversation was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. "Mom," Georgia said after we'd caught up on basic pleasantries, "I have to ask, is everything okay with you and Ginger? When I called last month to wish Timothy happy birthday, she answered your phone and told me you were resting and couldn't talk. Then when I called back later, Oliver said you'd had a wonderful conversation with me. But we never actually spoke." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" "Ginger told me you'd said I didn't need to send a birthday gift this year because Timothy had everything he needed, and that you'd call me back when you felt up to it. But you never called, and when I mentioned it to Oliver, he seemed confused and said you'd told him how nice it was to talk to me." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. Ginger had been intercepting my calls with my own daughter, creating fictional conversations, and manipulating both sides to believe communication had occurred when it hadn't. This wasn't just about replacing me in Timothy's life. She'd been systematically cutting me off from my entire family network. "Georgia," I said carefully, "I never spoke to you last month, and I would never tell you not to send Timothy a gift." The silence on the other end was profound. Then Georgia said quietly, "Mom, what exactly is going on there?" I spent the next hour on the phone with my daughter, piecing together a pattern of intercepted calls, deflected visits, and carefully constructed stories designed to make it seem like I was voluntarily withdrawing from family relationships. Georgia had been told I was too tired for long phone conversations. My sister Harriet in Minneapolis had apparently been informed that I was overwhelmed with Timothy's care and needed space. Even my longtime neighbor Julian had been told I was dealing with some health issues and preferred not to have visitors. Ginger had created an elaborate fiction in which I was a fragile, elderly woman who was naturally pulling back from social engagement due to age and fatigue. Everyone who might have noticed my gradual erasure from family life had been given plausible explanations for my absence. After hanging up with Georgia, I made a series of calls that painted an even clearer picture. My sister Harriet was shocked to learn that I hadn't been too overwhelmed to talk to her. She'd been told by Ginger that I'd specifically asked for space. My neighbor Julian had been bringing my mail to the front door instead of visiting because he'd been told I was having some cognitive issues and got confused by unexpected visitors. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Ginger hadn't just been pushing me out of my central role in Timothy's life. She'd been systematically destroying my connections to everyone else who might notice or object to what was happening. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when I checked my email account, which I'd been accessing less frequently since Ginger had helpfully set up a new computer system that she said was more user-friendly. I found dozens of unread messages, from friends and extended family members, asking if I was okay, expressing concern about my sudden lack of communication, wondering if they'd done something to offend me. Ginger had been deleting emails from my account while simultaneously telling people that I was choosing not to respond to their attempts at contact. She'd created a perfect circle of isolation, making it appear that I was voluntarily withdrawing from relationships while actually preventing me from maintaining them. As I read through months of deleted messages from people who cared about me, people who'd been led to believe I no longer wanted their friendship, I felt a rage so pure and focused that it was almost calming. This wasn't just manipulation. This was elder abuse, carefully disguised as helpful family management. I spent the rest of the afternoon creating detailed lists of every deception I'd uncovered, every relationship that had been sabotaged, every way that Ginger had isolated me while making it appear voluntary. I documented dates, phone calls, and specific lies that could be verified. By the time Oliver and Ginger returned home that evening, I had assembled a comprehensive picture of a 5-year campaign designed not just to replace me in Timothy's life, but to completely erase me from existence while making everyone believe it was my own choice. The old Grace would have confronted them immediately, demanding explanations and apologies. But the new Grace understood that information was power, and I was just getting started gathering the evidence I would need for what came next. I began my counteroffensive exactly where Ginger had started her campaign, in my kitchen. If she wanted to control the heart of my home, she was about to learn what happened when Grace Sullivan decided to remind everyone whose kitchen this actually was. The next Monday morning, I woke up at 4:30 a.m., a full hour before my usual time, and 90 minutes before Ginger typically started her day. I moved quietly through my house, gathering the supplies I'd purchased during a strategic shopping trip the day before. Ingredients for Timothy's favorite pancakes, fresh coffee beans, and most importantly, a large box of items I'd been storing in my bedroom. By the time Ginger came downstairs at 6 a.m., she found me already at work in a kitchen that looked dramatically different from the one she'd gone to sleep with. Every single item she'd rearranged over the past 2 years had been moved back to its original location. My spice rack was organized by frequency of use again, not alphabetically. My coffee maker was back on its proper counter. My favorite wooden spoons were in their rightful drawer. But the most significant change was the large wooden recipe box sitting prominently on the counter, the same box that had held my family's treasured recipes for 30 years, the one that Ginger had gradually pushed aside in favor of her Pinterest meal plans and trendy cooking blogs. "Oh," Ginger said, stopping short in the kitchen doorway. "You're up early." "Good morning, Ginger," I replied pleasantly, not looking up from the pancake batter I was mixing. I decided it was time to get back to my normal routine. I realized I'd been letting myself become a bit too relaxed about maintaining my household. She walked slowly into the kitchen, her eyes taking in all the changes. I could see her processing what had happened, trying to determine if this was some kind of challenge or simply an innocent return to old habits. "I see you've rearranged things," she said carefully. "I've put things back where they belong," I corrected, still maintaining that pleasant tone. "I realize you've been trying to help by organizing, but I find I work more efficiently when everything is in its familiar place. I hope you understand." The beauty of my approach was that it was completely reasonable. What could she possibly say? That I wasn't allowed to organize my own kitchen the way I preferred? That I couldn't cook in my own house? "Where's Timothy?" I asked, beginning to pour pancake batter into the pan. "It's Tuesday, pancake day." "He's still sleeping," Ginger said, and I caught the slight edge in her voice. "Usually I let him sleep until 7, then give him breakfast." "Oh, that's fine," I said brightly. "I'll just keep these warm for him." Nothing better than fresh pancakes when you're ready for them. I busied myself at the stove, aware that Ginger was still standing in the doorway, unsure how to respond to this development. She'd grown accustomed to being the first one up, the one who controlled the morning routine, the one who decided what Timothy would eat and when. But I wasn't arguing with her or creating conflict. I was simply existing in my own space, doing what I'd always done. When Timothy came downstairs 20 minutes later, his face lit up with genuine joy at seeing me in the kitchen with a plate of his favorite pancakes ready and waiting. "Grandma Grace! Pancakes!" he exclaimed, climbing onto his special red stool with enthusiasm I hadn't seen in months. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, placing the plate in front of him. "It's Tuesday." I watched Ginger's face carefully as Timothy dove into his breakfast with obvious delight, chattering about how much he'd missed our Tuesday tradition. She couldn't object without seeming petty and controlling, but I could see the frustration building behind her careful smile. "Ginger," I said, turning to her with that same pleasant tone. "Would you like some pancakes? I made plenty." The offer put her in an impossible position. Accepting would seem like acknowledging my authority in the kitchen. Declining would make her appear ungracious and unwelcoming toward family tradition. She chose a middle path. "Thank you, but I usually have yogurt and fruit in the morning. I'm trying to maintain a healthy breakfast routine." The implication was clear. My pancakes weren't healthy. My cooking wasn't suitable for modern nutritional standards. But I'd anticipated this response. "Of course," I said agreeably, "though these are made with whole wheat flour, fresh blueberries, and organic eggs." I updated the recipe based on some excellent nutritional information I found. But yogurt is lovely, too. I'd turned her own weapons against her, the health-conscious cooking, the concern for Timothy's nutrition, the suggestions for improvement, but I'd done it without a trace of confrontation or criticism. Over the following week, I systematically reclaimed every territory that Ginger had slowly conquered. I resumed grocery shopping, but I was strategic about it. Instead of simply buying what I'd always bought, I researched the most nutritious, organic, and expensive versions of everything. When Ginger complained about the grocery bills, I expressed surprise. "Oh, I thought you'd be pleased," I said innocently. "I've been reading about the importance of quality ingredients for growing children. This organic produce is exactly what Timothy needs for optimal development." I began meal planning again, but I chose recipes that were not only delicious, but also impressively sophisticated. I enrolled in an online cooking class focused on healthy gourmet meals for families. When Ginger suggested that my cooking was too elaborate for daily meals, I looked confused. "But Timothy loves trying new foods," I said. "And I thought you appreciated when I put effort into providing nutritious, well-prepared meals for the family." Every move I made was designed to be unassailable. How could anyone object to better nutrition, more sophisticated cooking, or a grandmother who was actively working to improve her skills? But the cumulative effect was that I was reclaiming my position as the primary food provider and kitchen manager in my own home. The most satisfying moment came when Timothy asked one morning if I could teach him to make pancakes, the way you do them, Grandma Grace. Ginger tried to redirect the conversation, suggesting that cooking might be too dangerous for a 4-year-old, but I was ready. "Actually," I said, "I've been reading about age-appropriate cooking activities for children. There are wonderful educational benefits to involving kids in food preparation. It teaches them about nutrition, following directions, and basic math skills." I'd researched everything thoroughly, armed myself with expert opinions and educational theories. Ginger couldn't argue against child development research without seeming ignorant or obstructive. Within 2 weeks, I had reclaimed complete control of my kitchen, and I'd done it so reasonably that Ginger couldn't complain without revealing her own manipulative intentions. But this was just the beginning of my campaign. With the kitchen secured, I turned my attention to reclaiming the rest of my home. But this phase required more subtlety. I needed to dismantle Ginger's territorial claims without appearing petty or vindictive. Every move had to seem natural, reasonable, even generous. I started with what I called spring cleaning, though it was actually October. One crisp Saturday morning, while Ginger was out with Timothy at his soccer game, I began a comprehensive reorganization of my living spaces. But instead of simply moving Ginger's items, I upgraded everything. The throw pillows she'd replaced mine with? I donated them to charity and purchased new ones that were not only more expensive, but also coordinated perfectly with my original decor. Her scented candles? I replaced them with high-end aromatherapy candles that I explained were better for Timothy's developing respiratory system. Her magazines cluttering my coffee table? I organized them neatly in a beautiful wooden magazine rack that I positioned by her favorite chair, containing them to her personal space rather than letting them spread throughout my living room. When Ginger returned and noticed the changes, I was ready with reasonable explanations for everything. I realized the house was looking a bit cluttered, I told her pleasantly. I thought with Timothy getting older and having friends over more often, we should maintain a more organized, welcoming environment. Don't you think it looks more spacious now? What could she say? That she preferred clutter? That she didn't want the house to look welcoming for her son's friends? My next strategic move involved the family photos. Instead of simply removing Ginger's pictures, I created what I called a family gallery wall in the hallway. I spent an entire afternoon arranging photographs that told the complete story of our family. Arthur and me as newlyweds, Oliver and Georgia as children, holidays and celebrations spanning decades, and yes, recent photos of Timothy. But the proportion was carefully calculated. For every recent photo featuring Ginger, there were 3 or 4 showing the deep history of this house and family. The overall effect was to place Ginger's presence in context. She was part of our story, but not the beginning or the center of it. When she questioned the new arrangement, I expressed surprise at her concerns. "I thought you'd love seeing Timothy surrounded by his family history," I said. "It's so important for children to understand their roots, don't you think? I want him to see how much love has filled this house over the years." More challenging was reclaiming the subtle social dynamics that Ginger had manipulated. I began answering my own phone again, but I did it strategically. I installed a second phone line in my bedroom and gave that number to my closest family and friends, explaining that I wanted to ensure I could always be reached directly. When the main house phone rang and Ginger moved to answer it, I would politely but firmly intercept. "Oh, I'll get that," I'd say pleasantly. "It's probably for me anyway." If Ginger protested or seemed confused, I had my explanation ready. "I realized I've been putting too much burden on you to handle my calls. You have enough to manage with Timothy and your own responsibilities." The brilliance of this approach was that it made her previous behavior seem presumptuous. Why would a daughter-in-law assume she should answer her mother-in-law's phone calls? I also began what I called reconnection with my social network. I invited my neighbor Julian over for coffee, something I hadn't done in months. When he arrived, and seemed surprised to see me looking so well and energetic, I was ready with my explanation. "Oh, Julian, I think there may have been some miscommunication," I said, serving him coffee and homemade cookies. "I heard you thought I wasn't feeling well, but I've actually been busier than ever. I've been taking some wonderful online classes and really focusing on improving my health and activities." Within an hour, Julian understood that reports of my decline had been greatly exaggerated. More importantly, he left with a clear impression that I was a vital, engaged woman who was very much in control of her own life and home. I repeated this process with other neighbors and friends, systematically correcting the narrative that Ginger had created about my withdrawal from social life. But I did it without directly contradicting her or creating obvious conflict. Instead, I simply demonstrated through my actions that the person they'd been told about, the confused, tired, overwhelmed elderly woman, didn't exist. The most delicate reclamation involved Timothy's routines, I couldn't simply take over his care without seeming to undermine Ginger's parenting, but I could create opportunities for us to rebuild our connection. I volunteered to drive Timothy to his activities, explaining that I enjoyed getting out of the house and wanted to be more involved in his interests. During these car rides, Timothy and I talked freely without Ginger's presence to monitor our conversations. I learned that he did remember our old traditions, that he had missed them, and that some of the changes in his behavior toward me had confused him as much as they'd hurt me. "Grandma Grace," he said one day as I drove him home from swimming lessons, "Mama Ginger said you were too tired to read me stories anymore. But you don't seem tired." "I'm not tired at all, sweetheart," I told him. "Would you like me to read to you tonight?" His face lit up with the kind of joy I remembered from his toddler years. "Yes. Can we read the dragon book? The one with the pictures you do voices for?" That evening, when I appeared in Timothy's room, with the worn copy of his favorite dragon story, Ginger looked surprised and slightly uncomfortable. "Oh," she said, "I was just about to read to Timothy." "That's so sweet of you," I replied, "but Timothy specifically asked me to read this particular book tonight. We have a special routine with the dragon voices that we developed together. Perhaps you could read to him tomorrow night?" Again, what could she say? That Timothy wasn't allowed to request bedtime stories from his grandmother? That she had exclusive rights to reading in her son's room? By the end of October, I had successfully reclaimed most of the territory that Ginger had slowly conquered over the past 2 years. But more importantly, I had begun to rebuild the relationships she had systematically undermined. Timothy was spending time with me again, my friends and neighbors were visiting, and the house felt like my home once more. But I could see that Ginger was growing increasingly frustrated with these developments. She'd grown accustomed to being the center of the household, the primary decision-maker, the person everyone turned to for answers. My quiet reclamation of my own space and relationships was threatening the power structure she'd worked so carefully to establish. I knew that her response, when it came, would be significant, and I was ready for it. Ginger's breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early November. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, a sophisticated mushroom risotto that required constant attention and stirring, when she stormed in with an expression I'd never seen before. Gone was the careful mask of consideration and helpfulness. What I saw was pure, undiluted fury. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. I continued stirring the risotto, not looking up. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" "You know exactly what's on my mind, Grace." She moved closer to the stove, invading my space in a way that felt threatening. "This little game you've been playing for the past month." "Game?" I kept my voice genuinely puzzled, still focusing on my cooking. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't." Her voice was sharp now, all pretense of politeness abandoned. "Don't play innocent with me. You've been systematically undermining everything I've built here." I added another ladle of warm broth to the rice, watching it absorb slowly before speaking. "Ginger, I think there might be some confusion. I've simply been resuming my normal activities in my own home. I wasn't aware that would be a problem for you." "Your normal activities?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean taking over Timothy's bedtime routine? Monopolizing his time with car rides and special cooking lessons? Rearranging everything in the house back to your outdated preferences?" I finally looked up from the risotto, meeting her eyes with calm directness. "Are you suggesting that I shouldn't spend time with my grandson? That I shouldn't maintain my own home according to my preferences?" "I'm suggesting," she said, stepping even closer, "that you need to remember your place in this family." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of the risotto. Those words hung in the air between us, the first time Ginger had spoken her true thoughts so clearly. "My place?" I repeated softly. "In my own home? With my own grandson?" "Timothy doesn't need 2 mothers confusing him," Ginger snapped. He needs stability, consistency, clear boundaries about who's in charge of his care. And you believe that? Should be you. I am his mother. Oliver is his father. This is our family unit. She paused, searching for words that would hurt, but still maintain some veneer of respectability. Your extended family. Important, of course, but not central to his daily life. I turned off the heat under the risotto and set down my wooden spoon. For 5 years, I'd been waiting for this moment, for Ginger to drop her mask completely and reveal what she really thought about my role in this house. Extended family, I repeated thoughtfully. In my own home, the home I've owned for 45 years, the home where I raised Oliver, the home where I've lived my entire adult life. Grace, you know what I mean. No, Ginger, I interrupted, my voice still calm but with an edge of steel that stopped her mid-sentence. I don't think I do know what you mean. Perhaps you could explain to me exactly what my place should be in my own house, with my own family, in my own life. She stared at me for a long moment, perhaps realizing she'd gone too far, revealed too much, but she was too angry to back down now. Your place, she said deliberately, is to support our decisions about Timothy's upbringing, to be helpful when asked, to respect that Oliver and I are his parents and we make the choices about his care, his routines, his relationships. I see, I said quietly. And if I disagree with those choices? Then you keep your disagreements to yourself, she said flatly. Or find somewhere else to live. There it was. The ultimatum I'd known was coming ever since I'd begun reclaiming my own life. Submit to Ginger's authority in my own home, or leave. I smiled. A calm, confident smile that seemed to unnerve her more than anger would have. Well, I said pleasantly, that's certainly an interesting perspective, Ginger. Thank you for being so clear about your expectations. She waited for more, for arguments, tears, capitulation, or defiance. Instead, I simply returned to my risotto as if she hadn't just threatened to kick me out of my own house. Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes, I said conversationally. Would you mind calling Oliver and Timothy to the table? That evening, after Timothy was asleep and Oliver had retreated to his home office to finish some work, I found Ginger in the living room scrolling through her phone with a satisfied expression. She probably thought her kitchen ultimatum had settled things, that I'd gotten the message about who was really in charge. Ginger, I said pleasantly, do you have a few minutes to chat? I have something I'd like to discuss with you. She looked up, her expression guarded but confident. Of course. I sat down across from her, placing a manila folder on the coffee table between us. I've been thinking about our conversation earlier, about my place in this family and this household. You made some very interesting points. She straightened slightly, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. I realized, I continued, that we've never actually discussed the practical arrangements of this living situation. When you moved in 5 years ago, everything was so informal, so based on family affection and mutual help. But you're right, that we should be clearer about expectations and boundaries. I opened the folder and pulled out the first set of documents. So, I've put together some information that I think will help us understand exactly where we all stand. Ginger's eyes dropped to the papers, and I watched her face change as she began to process what she was seeing. Bank statements, utility bills, property tax records, mortgage payments, all showing my name as the sole owner and payer. This, I said, tapping the first document, is the deed to this house. As you can see, I am the sole owner. Arthur and I bought it in 1978, and when he passed, it became mine entirely. I pulled out the next set of papers. These are the mortgage payment records. The house has been paid off for 12 years now. These are the property tax statements, $8,400 annually, paid from my accounts. And these are the utility bills showing the average monthly costs. Ginger was reading now, her confidence beginning to crack as she saw the numbers. The interesting thing, I continued conversationally, is how dramatically the utility costs increased when you moved in. Before you arrived, my monthly utilities averaged $180. Since you've been here, they've averaged $420. That's an additional $240 per month, or $2,880 per year. I pulled out more documents. Grocery expenses have increased from about $200 monthly to $650 monthly. Home insurance went up when I added you to the policy. The wear and tear on appliances, the increased water usage, the heating and cooling costs for additional bedrooms. It's all documented here. Grace, what are you— Over 5 years, I said, continuing without acknowledging her interruption. Housing you, Oliver, and Timothy has cost me approximately $127,000 in direct expenses. That doesn't include the meals I've prepared, the childcare I've provided, or the general maintenance and upkeep that comes with a larger household. I leaned back in my chair, watching as she flipped through page after page of financial records. Now, I want to be very clear. I never asked for reimbursement because you were family. I considered it an investment in our relationships, in Timothy's well-being, in helping Oliver establish his career. Ginger finally looked up from the papers, her face pale. I don't understand why you're showing me this. Because, I said with a gentle smile, you mentioned earlier that I should know my place in this household. And you're absolutely right. I should know exactly where I stand. I pulled out one final document, a formal lease agreement I'd had my attorney prepare that afternoon. So I've taken your advice and clarified my position. As the homeowner, I'm establishing formal rental terms for continued occupancy of this property. The monthly rent will be $2,800, quite reasonable for a 4-bedroom house in this neighborhood, especially one that includes utilities, cable, internet, and weekly housekeeping. Services. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The lease begins December 1st, I continued pleasantly. First and last month's rent due upon signing, along with a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent. Standard terms: no pets without permission, no alterations to the property, and certainly no unauthorized rearrangement of the homeowner's personal belongings. I stood up, smoothing my skirt. You can take your time reviewing the documents, but I'll need your decision by Friday so we can either proceed with the lease or discuss alternative arrangements for your family's housing needs. I headed toward the stairs, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Ginger, in my house I decide what my place is. Oliver found us exactly where I'd expected him to. Ginger sitting at the kitchen table at 11 p.m., surrounded by financial documents, her face streaked with tears, while I calmly prepared my nightly cup of chamomile tea. What's going on here? He asked, looking between his wife's obvious distress and my serene composure. Your mother, Ginger said, her voice shaking with emotion, has just presented me with a bill for $127,000 and a rental lease demanding $12,800 a month. Oliver's eyebrows shot up. What? I turned from the stove, carrying my steaming mug. Not a bill, Oliver. Historical documentation, and not a demand, an option. Ginger asked me to clarify my place in this household, so I've provided some clarity about everyone's position. Mom, what are you talking about? I sat down at the table across from them, noting how Ginger immediately positioned herself closer to Oliver, seeking his protection and support. Perhaps you should look at the documents yourself. Oliver picked up the lease agreement first, scanning the terms with the careful eye of someone who understood legal documents. Then he moved to the financial records, his expression growing more serious with each page. These utility costs, he said slowly. This is what it's actually cost for us to live here? Plus property taxes, insurance increases, grocery expenses, and general household maintenance costs associated with a larger family, I confirmed. All itemized by year if you'd like to review the breakdown. Oliver continued reading, his face growing pale. Mom, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever mention Because we're family, I said simply. I was happy to provide a home for you and Ginger and Timothy. I considered it an investment in our relationships and Timothy's well-being. Then, why bring it up now? He asked, though I could see understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. Ginger jumped in before I could answer. She's trying to kick us out. She's angry that I've become close to Timothy, that he sees me as his primary mother figure, so she's using money to manipulate the situation. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting Ginger's words hang in the air. Oliver looked at me expectantly, waiting for my response. Oliver, I said carefully, did Ginger tell you about our conversation this evening? He looked between us. What conversation? The one where she explained my place in this family, where she informed me that I am extended family, not central to Timothy's daily life, where she told me that my role should be to support your parenting decisions silently or find somewhere else to live? Oliver's head snapped toward Ginger. You said what? I didn't, that's not, she's twisting what I said, Ginger protested. I was just trying to establish healthy boundaries. Timothy was getting confused about who was in charge of his care. By telling my mother to find somewhere else to live? Oliver's voice was rising. In her own house? Oliver, you don't understand how manipulative she's been, Ginger said desperately. She's been systematically undermining my authority with Timothy, taking over his routines, contradicting my decisions, making him think he doesn't have to listen to me. I set down my teacup with careful precision. Oliver, would you like to know what actually happened this evening? He nodded, his jaw tight. Ginger came into the kitchen while I was cooking dinner and told me I needed to remember my place. She said Timothy doesn't need two mothers confusing him, that she and you are his family unit, and that I'm extended family who should support your decisions quietly or leave. Is that true? Oliver asked Ginger directly. The silence stretched between them, and I could see Ginger calculating whether to lie or try to justify her words. She chose a middle path. I may have expressed myself poorly, she said finally. But the sentiment was valid. We do need clear boundaries about Timothy's care. Oliver looked at the lease agreement again, then at the financial documents, then at his wife and mother. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. Mom, we need to talk privately. Oliver and I walked out to the porch, leaving Ginger alone, with the financial documents that laid bare 5 years of my subsidizing their life. The November air was crisp, and I pulled my sweater closer as we sat in the wicker chairs where Arthur and I used to watch the sunset. Mom, Oliver said quietly, I'm so sorry. I had no idea about any of this. Not the money, not what Ginger said to you tonight. I reached over and patted his hand. I know you didn't, sweetheart. You've been working so hard to provide for your family. You trusted that the women in your life could work things out peacefully. But $127,000, he said, shaking his head. Mom, that's more than 2 years of my salary. How could I not notice? Because I didn't want you to notice, I said. Honestly, I wanted to help. I wanted Timothy to grow up in a stable, loving environment. I wanted Ginger to feel secure enough to become the mother she was capable of being. Oliver was quiet for a long moment, processing everything. What she said to you tonight, about finding somewhere else to live, in your own house. That's... He trailed off, unable to finish. Unacceptable? I suggested gently. Inexcusable, he said firmly. Mom, this is your home. You raised me here. You've supported us for 5 years without ever making us feel like a burden. The idea that Ginger would tell you to leave, I could see the conflict in his face. Love for his wife warring with loyalty to his mother, confusion about how things had gotten so far out of hand. Oliver, I said carefully, I'm going to give you and Ginger a choice. It's more than she gave me, but I believe in offering people the chance to do the right thing. He looked at me expectantly. Option 1. Sign the lease. Pay fair market rent for this beautiful home. Treat me with the respect due to both your mother and your landlord. Establish clear, healthy boundaries that acknowledge my central role in Timothy's life while respecting your parental authority. And option 2? Find your own housing by January 1st. I'll give you 2 months to locate something suitable. I'll even help with the security deposit as a final gift to help you get established. Oliver stared out at the dark street, his hands clasped tightly together. And if we choose option 1, what would that look like day to day? I continue living in my home as its owner. Timothy continues having a close relationship with his grandmother. Ginger treats me as family, not as unwanted competition. We all communicate with respect and consideration. She's not going to like either option, Oliver said finally. I'm not particularly concerned with what Ginger likes anymore, I replied. I'm concerned with what's sustainable, what's fair, and what's best for Timothy. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us thinking about the crossroads we'd reached. Can I ask you something, Mom? Oliver said eventually. Of course. When did you stop making excuses for her? I smiled sadly. When Timothy asked permission to eat the pancakes I made him, when I realized she'd trained my own grandson to feel guilty about loving me. Oliver's face tightened with pain and anger. I never wanted this. I never wanted you to feel unwelcome in your own home. I know you didn't, sweetheart, but it happened anyway. And now we have to decide what comes next. When we went back inside, Ginger was still at the kitchen table, but now she was making phone calls. I heard her saying something about impossible situation and emotional manipulation before she noticed us and quickly hung up. So, I said pleasantly, have you had a chance to review everything thoroughly? Ginger looked at Oliver expectantly, clearly hoping he would take her side, demand that I rescind the lease, insist that things go back to the way they were. Instead, Oliver said quietly, we need to talk about this seriously, Ginger. We need to figure out what's fair for everyone. The look of shock and betrayal that crossed Ginger's face told me everything I needed to know about what she'd expected from this confrontation. She'd thought Oliver would automatically side with her, that she could manipulate the situation to make me look like the unreasonable one. You have until Friday to decide, I said, heading toward the stairs. Good night. As I climbed the steps to my bedroom, I could hear their voices rising in heated discussion below. But for the first time in 5 years, their conflict wasn't my responsibility to solve. I'd given them a choice. What they did with it would determine whether Ginger finally learned to respect me, or whether she'd be packing her bags with empty hands. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.